Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and the Square Enix news train just doesn't seem to be stopping at all because we have more information regarding Crisis Core Reunion and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. A bunch of interviews were released by various media outlets both in the West and East with three key members of the development team. That would be Mariko Sato, the producer, Yoshinori Kitase, the executive producer, and Tetsuya Nomura, the director. They cover all sorts of details about Crisis Core, how it's staying the same, and how it's changing, while also intertwining that into some details regarding Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I'm going to include a bunch of links in the description, but I'll be giving you kind of a breakdown of each of them because there is a lot of repeat information across the ones that I have seen. There's also probably more of them, especially Japanese media sites usually have a lot more information, but we're waiting on more translations for those, so if I decide to do a follow-up video, it'll likely be with the other Japanese media sites. Alright, first we're going to be looking at the article from Press Start. Now I'm going to be playing some footage in the background and just giving you the overview of what is in that interview. First, they want to reiterate, and this is something that is present across all of the interviews, that this is a faithful retelling of Crisis Core Reunion's original story. They've been wanting to do it for quite some time, even when they first started doing Final Fantasy VII Remake, but the timing just didn't seem right until they were between the period of releasing Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Now the story is going to be remaining the same, but they are going to be making adjustments to things like gameplay, the soundtrack, and of course the visuals. They also talk about some things that they were limited on because the original game was on the PSP, specifically the camera controls. It's just going to be easier now than it was back then, simple as that. They also said that this was especially important because they were moving a portable game to the big screen. They want modern players to feel like they have modern quality of life and that they're not playing a game that was released 15 years ago. They also do make a brief mention of the difference in resolution, specifically between the PlayStation 5 and the Switch version, saying that the two will definitely have different resolutions and FPS, but without any further detail. Everything else in this piece is largely supportive of these points, so let's move on to article number 2. Next up, we have Eurogamer. Like I said, this is largely a retread, especially of the faithful retelling of the story bit, but they did go over some additional gameplay details. For one, Zack's basic sword attacks can be tied together as combos instead of individual button presses, making it just feel a little bit more modern. On top of that, magic and abilities can be set to one-button shortcuts for instant use, just making them more accessible without as much command-based menu interactions. And limit breaks and summons are actually stored for later use when they appear in the digital mind wave, the slot machine feature, something I'm not really a huge fan of, specifically meaning the actual digital mind wave, not this change. This change is definitely good. It's a little bit at odds with what some of the other interviews say, talking about just how they are not coupled anymore, but this seems to be a more in-depth answer, saying that when they appear on the slot machine, that you can then choose when to use them instead of being forced to use them immediately, which does sound like an improvement over the original gameplay. Their goal with releasing the Crisis Core Reunion remaster is that they really want more people to meet Zack and understand his character due to his prevalence in Final Fantasy VII Remake and the entire trilogy, especially after some of the scenes in Remake itself. They're also carefully working on the various other games in the Final Fantasy VII Remake franchise, including Ever Crisis and First Soldier. Who knows, we may see some other fan favorites. I know some of you out there are looking towards a remaster of Dirge of Cerberus. Who knows? Could happen. They're talking about how they want to fill in the gaps between different releases, so I would say that one's a foregone conclusion, but no official confirmation just yet. Right now they're focused on making sure that every game they do release as part of this little new compilation that they're doing is something that new and old fans will enjoy alike. That's it for article number 2. Let's move to number 3. The next one's IGN, and I think this one's the shortest one to cover. It further elaborates on the differences in FPS, saying that the PC version should get a steady 120 frames per second, of course depending on your hardware, while the PS5 and Xbox versions will be aiming for 60 FPS. No mentions made of the Switch version, but I think we're all expecting the 30 FPS experience, especially given the mention in the other interview. They also talk about how all the voice actors have been replaced. Well, almost all of them. They specifically mention that Caleb Pierce is taking over as Zack, and Brianna White is reprising her role as Aerith from Final Fantasy VII Remake. We'll cover the other voice actors, or at least the one that hasn't changed, probably the one you're expecting to not change the most, in one of the other interviews. Other than that, it just reiterates that no changes are being made to the story, something they really seem to want to get across after what has happened with Final Fantasy VII Remake and the speculation regarding 7 Rebirth. For our last English site, we have PlayStation Universe. Now, this actually talks a little bit more in depth about the actual game itself, the core of it, specifically how all the game assets were recreated from scratch, with visuals and scenes improved from the original. They did not just remaster old assets, they wanted to bring it up to the graphical fidelity that speaks to the current age, especially for the consoles it's being released on. This should be evident given the trailer shows us just how improved those graphics are over the original PSP version. Now, the soundtrack will only feature the remastered version. There won't be a way to switch between the original and the remaster, and that's being done because it's being composed by the same individual, so it should be very, very faithful to that original soundtrack. It also, in what is probably the most important news for anyone who's been a long-time Final Fantasy fan, especially if you've been a Crisis Core fan, it finally tackles the rumor regarding Gackt. Now, if you don't know, Gackt is the physical character model for one of the characters in Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core named Genesis. He's also the Japanese voice actor for the character. It's been a long time rumor that the reason Crisis Core was trapped on the PSP was because of licensing issues with him, and there's never been any comment on it before, so of course the internet perpetuates it as absolute truth. I myself have mentioned it in previous videos as well. Now, Nomura outright refutes that, saying it's not at all the case, and it's always been a matter of timing. He also states that Gackt's voice lines are unchanged from the Japanese dub, but that he also did not record any new ones. But he is still the Japanese voice actor for Genesis at the end of the day. And the only other thing is that there's no comment on a collector's edition. So with that little bombshell regarding Gackt, sorry for hitting the mic on that little one right there, let's move over to the Japanese media site 4Gamer. Now, of course, I don't speak or translate Japanese, so special shout out to Audrey, or at Aitai Kimochi on Twitter. We reference her work many a time here, and while she is currently traveling abroad, she still took time to do some translations for this particular interview, with a promise of doing more translations for the other Japanese media sites in the near future. So, this interview covers a little bit more about 7 Rebirth in addition to Crisis Core Reunion. Now, originally, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was planned for winter of 2023, and Nomura confirms that this is still the case. The interviewer actually specifically says that winter of 2023 is only about a year and a half away, to which Nomura replies yes. This seems to imply that while many of us expect a late to March kind of winter release, that it could be as early as December, maybe even early January. Anything is possible, but it's never made entirely clear based on the way that the interview is actually conducted. I'm still in the boat that I think it will be as close to the end of winter as could possibly be. Also, it is a reminder that Zack is key to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and players should definitely go out of their way to enjoy Reunion and even Ever Crisis ahead of Rebirth and the final game of the trilogy. It will only fill out their experience even more. They also talk about the Buster Sword design in Crisis Core. In the original, it was based more on the Advent Children model, but here in Crisis Core Reunion, they're making sure it's consistent with the Final Fantasy VII Remake design for the Buster Sword. Now, this makes sense given one of the other statements that's made in this interview. The game's story is again unchanged. However, the title Reunion is deliberately used to tie it into the whole naming scheme of the remake series. You know, remake, rebirth, reunion, and some other re-word that we get for the third game. So, does that serve as an indication that there will be any changes that they aren't telling us? No, I think they're telling the truth about the fact that the game's story will remain unchanged. Nomura even says that history has not been changed, the events before Final Fantasy VII Remake. However, I wouldn't be surprised, and Audrey expresses this as well, if they include a teaser for Rebirth at the end of Reunion to really hold us over. Another minute and a half or 2-minute cutscene will probably do exactly the trick you expect it to do, especially on social media, despite the fact that no one really seems to care about spoilers anymore when talking about 7 Remake. Now, Nomura also mentions that in Rebirth and in the third game of the trilogy, that some locations may be visited out of order. So you may get to a scene, expect to see a certain location, and think that they cut it all together, but that's not the case. They're just not visiting them in the exact same order. Why that's the case? Well, play Rebirth in the third game and you will find out. Now, he also says to pay careful attention to the actual details as you're playing every game that's part of the Remake series. He claims that while history hasn't changed in Crisis Core Reunion, that Remake has an important mystery that gradually unravels, and the more you understand about the series and the franchise, the more you'll be able to determine on your own as the games play out. And that's going to be it for all of the interviews that we currently have to go over for Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion and Rebirth. Really excited to be getting this news and excited to be reminded that we're probably 6 to 8 months away from Crisis Core Reunion releasing, much closer than I think I was even thinking a month ago when we first learned about this stuff. Let me know what you think about some of the details you heard in these interviews. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned for more information regarding, well, not just Final Fantasy VII compilation, but all the Square Enix properties we've been covering on the channel. Anyway, thanks for watching, and until next time, take care.